I'm joined today by my old friend and writing partner, Lamar Waldron. For the first time in, I think it's been a couple of years. Lamar and I began working together researching the JFK assassination back in November of 1988. So you can do the math on that one. We worked together on Lamar's first two nonfiction books, Ultimate Sacrifice and Legacy of Secrecy. You can find them, they're still in print. And then on his own, Lamar wrote the definitive book, The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination. Chicago Tribune called Lamar one of the best investigative journalists in the United States. Variety called him the ultimate JFK historian. We were both on two Discovery Channel specials produced by NBC News. Lamar has been featured in specials in Germany and Japan, and also on CNN and MSNBC. And Lamar, it's great to have you back with us.
Great to be with you again, Tom.
So is it true that not only Trump has not released all the JFK assassination files, but that he really hasn't released any of the most important files? What's going on here?
That's exactly right. I mean, there have been so many newspaper articles, and of course, online articles, and even on the evening news broadcasts, and of course, CNN and MSNBC, and everybody, and I think even Trump himself, have basically said, yeah, it's kind of a nothing burger and all this kind of stuff. And it's so frustrating because you and I have been working literally since 1988 to try to get these files released, and some have been released. People that worked with John and Robert Kennedy helped us find them. I helped the last of the 5 government investigations look for and find some of the important files in the 1990s when I was a confidential informant for them, which means I actually have a secret file in Washington, but it has actually been released. But mainly, people say, well, 80,000 pages have been released, or just ridiculously big numbers. But I'll give you an example. There was one document, it was pretty long, probably 5 or 10 or more pages. It had all been released back in the 1990s. But the cover company for a CIA agent had been blacked out. So now Nestle, the chocolate company, that provided cover for a CIA agent, not even back in '63. It was a different year. Now that has been uncensored, and so that's 15 or 20 pages right there, which is a total nothing burger, which is absolutely nothing.
Well, and not only that, a lot of the agents and people involved now we're getting their Social Security numbers and their private information.
Well, you remember going to Joe Cambese's with Gate and Fonzie, I believe.
Yep, you and me, the three of us. Yeah, this is the old mob restaurant down in Dallas, and somebody, while we were in there, somebody came out and smashed up our car.
Well, it could have been a coincidence. Just because we were there with a former Senate and House investigator and a former FBI agent, and with the archivist from Miami-Dade County. So here's the bottom line. Here's what every news outlet in America has been missing, and your listeners get to hear it. So the National Archives has a JFK records collection. And I, like I say, in the 90s, I worked on 2 different occasions with 2 different people on the JFK Assassination Records Review Board, created after the Oliver Stone movie. And this was a distinguished group of, judges and historians, and they were supposed to release all the JFK files. They were all supposed to be released by the end of the 90s. But what they quickly found was the agencies were not just stonewalling them. In some cases, agencies like the Secret Service said, oh, that law says we're supposed to preserve everything? Well, darn it, we must have made a mistake because we just destroyed all these important files about JFK's trips and any assassination threats in the 3 weeks before Dallas. So we just destroyed those, even though the law passed last year says we should have kept them. So, and for the investigators whom I helped, so you had this distinguished group of historians, and it was headed by a judge, but then they hired a good professional staff of investigators and attorneys. And I worked with 2 of them, confidentially, and they were so incredibly frustrated I told them exactly how they could find the Naval Intelligence investigation of Oswald, which determined Oswald was incapable of doing the actual shooting because he was a terrible shot, even when he practiced. He hadn't practiced.
Oh, and the rifle was a piece of junk.
Oh, it was a horrible piece of crap. And before the FBI could even test fire it, they had to re-drill the scope, because if anybody shot through that scope, it was so badly mounted they couldn't have hit the side of a barn.
Wow.
And so and the Naval Intelligence concluded Oswald was incapable of masterminding the assassination. So that would have been front page news back in 1963 and 64.
Right.
But Naval Intelligence didn't want that to happen. Naval Intelligence was working with the CIA. Oswald was a CIA and Naval Intelligence asset when he went to Russia, when he came back, when he went to Mexico
City. I think most Americans don't even know that Oswald he was a Marine, he was trained in the Russian language, he was sent to Russia as a spy. The Russians saw this coming and they married him off to the daughter of a Russian intelligence officer. He failed as a spy and came back to the United States kind of with his tail between his legs. I mean,
and not only that, there were 5 people like Oswald that went over at the same time.
I know.
And 4 of them, just like Oswald, came back with Russian wives and girlfriends.
That's right. And we spent a lot of time with Oswald's wife, Marina, hearing about these stories. Pardon the interruption. Keep going, Lem.
Well, we interviewed tons of people close to John and Barbara Kennedy. We never interviewed Marina. I think you're thinking about the first TV special we were in that did feature Marina.
I recall meeting her at a hotel. Well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe my memory is. It's been a lot of years. It's been 40 years. Anyway.
Yeah, it's been a while. So so because what would she know?
Yeah.
And what you're probably also thinking of, I was one of the first people to get in quote the where they had bugged her bedroom.
Mm-hmm.
The Secret Service had.
Right. And
so you have actually seen some pretty intimate things there. Because she was bugged. So, but the point is, Oswald, when he was in the Marines, you and I are old enough, and we'll explain to your listeners what the U-2 spy plane was.
Mm.
And that launched from the base at Sugi, Japan. It was under the control of the CIA, and also the U.S. military. And so Oswald worked at that top secret base. And get this, so you had all these hot shot, Top Gun pilots, and the pilots that flew the U-2 spy planes over Russia, over communist China, those were the best of the best pilots, right? And we know from the Tom Cruise movie, pilots can be pretty cocky and arrogant, right? Because they risk their lives. And so so there was a bar just outside of Atsugi, Japan, and I think all the flyers and the poor enlisted people like Oswald, an officer, would go there. But of course, the B girls, preferred the officers and the pilots, right? Well, guess who was the most popular soldier at that bar? And got the most popular bar hostess, the Queen Bee she was called, was enlisted man Oswald, who hadn't even finished high school and whose pay was a tiny fraction of what those U-2 spy plane pilots were making. But again, that was, and he told one of his buddies, he said, hey, if you work for the CIA, I can get you in on that because that's what I'm doing. Yeah. So, they were keeping him under surveillance to see how, these B girls who might be working for Russia would try to recruit him. Mm-hmm. He goes to Russia, comes back with the Russian wife, and he is under tight surveillance, which I know from 2 different naval intelligence sources, the entire time he's back. You remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, right?
Oh, yeah.
Did you guys have to hide under your school desks or go to a bomb shelter?
We did duck and cover, in the 50s, yeah.
Yeah, so we actually went to the bomb shelter agriculture and stuff. So at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a year before JFK was killed, when we all thought we were going to get blown to atoms, on TV, there would be the UN ambassador, or JFK himself, would have these big maps of the Russian missile installations in Cuba. That's what the problem was, because now Russia had missiles 90 miles from the U.S. at Cuba, pointed at the U.S., and they had these big photographic maps, and they had all this nice big type. So it was real clear and easy to see. And so the UN ambassador would use those at the UN or on television. JFK would use them. So those maps, the wording for those maps, were done in Dallas at a place called Jagger's Child Stovall
by Oswald. Have these files not been released because of ineptitude? Or is it something else? No, it's not ineptitude. It is people trying to prevent. There was a reason we'll get to in a minute about, so there were some legitimate national security concerns, because this was a year after we were almost all blown to atoms during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Right. And if not for the cool heads of John and Robert Kennedy, we would be in a post-apocalyptic hellscape as we speak. So, no, it's agencies helping each other out. Again, so Oswald was from the Marines, officially naval intelligence, but as one of the naval intelligence people told me, who saw Oswald's file 2 months before the assassination, there was a big phone number in there. If anything ever happens to this guy, call this number at the CIA and talk to this person. Wow. So, so Oswald was kind of, both of them. So there's something called the third agency rule. And I hate to get into the weeds, but I think it's good if your listeners understand. In other words, so let's say the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the late 70s says, and they had heard, because there's some good people in the U.S. military, that naval intelligence investigated Oswald, and they wanted those files. Now, they were stonewalled by naval intelligence until they went out of business. But, you see, because Oswald was CIA, naval intelligence could have told the CIA, hey, it's going to be embarrassing for both of us if we give this report essentially exonerating Oswald to this House Select Committee. Right. So why don't you, as the CIA, tell us under the third agency rule that we can't release it? Mm. And if you have some stuff, Mr. CIA, that you don't want released, but even if we just got copies of it, well, then you tell us, and we'll say, oh no, CIA, you can't release that. And so that third agency rule is blocking all of this. So remember I said there is a JFK assassination records collection at the National Archives? Mm-hmm. And so both Biden and Trump said, we're going to release everything at the National Archives. Well, guess what? All the most important files are not at the National Archives, because if they were, they would have been released back in the 1990s, right, as they were supposed to be. Right. So that naval intelligence report, I mean, there's a sad story there, because so you and I talked a little bit about that on our first History Channel special, the one hosted by Roger Mudd. And the review board investigators, they heard about that. I made sure, because I sent them a letter saying this, that, and the other. And so they call, one of their investigators calls up and say, hey, yeah, I'm getting stonewalled from the Navy, from Navy intelligence, the Defense Department. So help me out. Well, what can you tell me? What can you give me? And so I tried to help her out as much as I could. And there was a naval officer, and I'm going to be careful here. There was a naval officer who tried to do their duty and track down those files. And they were ordered not to look any place outside of Naval Intelligence Headquarters. No place else in the Pentagon, no other naval base anywhere. And when that naval officer persisted, they were drummed
out of the service.
And Lamar, just as we were hitting the break, you kind of dropped a bombshell saying that the three arguably most prominent mafia godfathers in America all basically said to all confess to this crime. Tell us about that.
First, let me know, is it better if I keep holding the phone or just use the iPhone for video?
Yeah, keep holding the phone just in case, but
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, so it goes even more than that. So we're talking about people who all confessed late in life to people they never thought would betray them, not, making a phony confession like James Files, who was a low-level criminal for money or an attempt to get money. Now, Carlos Marcello at his peak was bigger than General Motors. Trafficante with all that heroin. Yeah, these guys were doing great. And so they made confessions late in life, very credible, and there's a mountain of evidence to back it up. And the reason they wanted to kill JFK was because John and Robert Kennedy came to prominence in the late 1950s going after the Mafia, because Richard Nixon and J. Edgar Hoover wouldn't. Nixon was getting support from the Mafia. Hoover had some unsavory Mafia connections. So the Mafia was running rampant in a lot of cities in America, not just big towns, but even smaller ones. And of course, they were running Cuba with all their casinos and stuff. So the Kennedys went after them with the Senate Rackets Committee. JFK didn't head it. He got most of the publicity. His chief counsel, who had started out as the chief counsel for Joe McCarthy and then left that for obvious reasons, was Robert Kennedy. And so they went after, they dragged Carlos Marcello, into the Senate hearing room. Trafficante had a hideout in Cuba, and that created some problems for him. So in other words, the Kennedys ran for office on the pledge that they would go after the Mafia and the Mafia's ally and backer, corrupt Teamster boss Jimmy Hoffa. And guess what? They fulfilled their campaign promise.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that before Jack Kennedy's presidency, there had never been more than 50 investigations of the Mafia in any one year in the history of America. And post 1961, it was hundreds every year that Kennedy was running?
Oh, 50 is a high number. There was a thing that the New York State Police were involved in called Appalachian up in New York City in the wake of the a murder that's in the new Robert De Niro movie that I recommend people see. And so a lot of the mob bosses had to get together. Marcello wasn't there, but a lot of other mob bosses were. New York State Police stumbled on that. Otherwise, like I say, Hoover, he just didn't care, and Nixon was actually getting money from the Mafia from the start of his political campaign. So John and Robert Kennedy, they were running for president. Bobby was essentially John's campaign manager. Nixon didn't want that to happen. He wanted to become president. So basically, Nixon ordered the CIA to hire the Mafia to kill Fidel Castro right before the election, because he had been vice president for 8 years.
This was the tail end of 59, the beginning of 1960. Most people don't even know that Richard Nixon was actually vice president then under Eisenhower.
And he was. And like I say, they don't know it because he didn't get to do much, except Ike didn't want to have to deal with Castro in Cuba, so he let Nixon deal with Castro and send Castro into the arms of Russia. But so literally Nixon ordered the CIA to hire the Mafia to kill Fidel right before the election. That would be a big brouhaha. And then, JFK was young. And frankly, Nixon had more foreign policy experience. And Nixon thought, well, the voters will come to me. And so I got to tell you, the Mafia was behind Nixon 110%. There are all these myths. The same way there's a myth that JFK's father was a bootlegger. No, he owned legitimate, legal liquor companies, but he wasn't a bootlegger. And the Mafia gave $1 million bribe to Nixon in 1960 just a couple months before the campaign, to help with his campaign and also to keep Jimmy Hoffa out of prison because they liked that money from the Teamster Pension Fund. So that was what was supposed to happen. It didn't happen. JFK got elected, and guess what the CIA did? They kept doing those plots with these mafia godfathers, Trafficanti, Marcello, and especially Roselli, right up literally until JFK was killed, without telling John and Robert Kennedy that the plots were ongoing. A year and a half later, they said, "Oh, we had these plots. We're sorry. We won't let that happen again." And they just kept doing it. And so that's how Trafficanti, Marcello, and Roselli, all of whom were CIA assets, and the CIA and FBI have admitted that, were able to kind of worm their way into JFK's top secret plans to stage a coup in Cuba on December 1st, 1963, 9 days after Dallas, where the head of the Cuban army was going to eliminate Fidel and Raul Castro and would then invite the U.S. in to prevent a Soviet takeover, because there were 11,000 Russians in Cuba at that time. And the Mafia was banned from the Kennedy's coup plan. They were banned from reopening their casinos after the coup was hopefully successful. The newspapers were full literally every day of Kennedy prosecutions against the Mafia. The Kennedys were getting ready to go into Las Vegas and run the Mafia out of Las Vegas. And so literally these mobsters felt like they had no choice. You know, it was literally kill or be killed, because Roselli and Marcello were not even U.S. citizens, so they could be deported at the drop of a hat. Marcello was deported right after John and Bobby Kennedy took office, but he snuck his way back in thanks to a pilot who was also a CIA agent by the name of David Ferry, who was Oswald's Civil Air Patrol instructor. And, you know, so you start to see... You start to see these connections, and it's not some giant, vast conspiracy. It's a really small one, and Robert Kennedy himself knew that it was Marcello, Trafficanti, and Roselli that killed his brother. How did he know that? He had at least 4 different people do private investigations for him, but only one of those people was Bobby's top aide, literally with, I believe, the office next to his. In all of 1963, only one of the people who did the private secret investigations for Bobby knew about all of the top secret coup plans, including the plan for a coup in Cuba. And that man was John Nolan. And it was the weirdest interview I ever had on the telephone after he canceled first a meeting at his office, then a lunch, and then I'm at the Mayflower Hotel, and every time we start talking about the plan for a coup in Cuba, the phone starts staticking. Had to go out in the hallway with a $20 bill, which was a lot more than $20 in the early 90s, and get a bellhop to bring me a fresh phone, and suddenly, from another room, there was no more static. And so John Nolan did the best secret investigation for Bobby Kennedy, and found out it was Trafficanti, Marcello, and Roselli. But because they had wormed their way into that top secret coup plan so thoroughly, the bullets that were used in the rifle found in the schoolbook depository. Now, notice I'm not saying that Oswald shot Kennedy with, because there's no proof of that, but the bullets in that rifle, the Mannlicher Carcano, a horrible gun, found on the 6th floor, were linked to a Dallas gun dealer. The ammo was, and in FBI files, that Dallas gun dealer, shortly before JFK is killed, was saying, you know, there's going to be this U.S. invasion of Cuba coming up around December the 1st, and a guy could make a lot of money in the stock market. I mean, the number of people in the government that were fully informed about this coup plan was so small. I talked to Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and he says, I didn't know that was a real operation. I thought we were just looking for somebody. Maybe we'll find someone. I didn't know we already had the number 3 guy in Cuba, the head of the Cuban army. But, you know, Russ said, look, if you told me that I have these assistants, these secretaries as they were called in those days, not Secretary of State, but, you know, the people who work in the office, he said, you couldn't have told me or McNamara. We're talking to the press every day. It would have gotten out. It would have been an open secret like the Bay of Pigs. So literally almost more people in the Mafia knew about this top secret plan they had wormed their way into than like I say, our own Secretary of State.